Well, welcome. I'm Mike Nelson. I'm a professor of Internet Studies at Georgetown, and in my spare time, which I have a little bit of, I spend a lot of time with the DC chapter of the Internet Society, which is hosting this event today. So this is being hosted by Microsoft's Innovation and Policy Center, and we're very grateful for Ken Zhang and Paula Boyd for allowing us to use this space. This is one of several events that we've hosted here as part of the Internet Society. This is also a meeting of the, of the Scott Marcus Fan Club. How many of you are members? Yes, okay. What happened was about a month and a half ago, I was helping organize the Internet Governance Forum USA, which was held on July 16th. And one of the sessions we had there was on net neutrality around the world. And so I contacted Scott and said, who should we have speak at this? And he told me that he was going to be in Europe, but he would be here on August 6th in Washington. And I said, this is a great excuse for another event. And so today we'll be looking at the very complicated topic of net neutrality in Europe and all the different ways in which it's being approached there and what that can tell us about what's happening here in the United States. If you read the press, or at least the mainstream press, you might get the idea that net neutrality is a very simple problem. It's all about whether bits are treated the same, and it's about whether we regulate to make sure that's the case. Both of those statements are wrong. Net neutrality is a lot more complicated than just how the bits are treated, and it's a lot more complicated than just regulating. There's a lot of other things here that will affect how the Internet develops, what kind of service customers get. This is an unusual event. Normally at ISOC events we have a panel of about 5 different people, and each person gets 5 minutes. Scott knows so much about this topic and about telecom regulation in Europe in general that we've given him a full 30 or 40 minutes to give you the full broad picture, and then we're going to have about 30 or 40 minutes for Q&A. Before we go straight to audience Q&A, Sally Wentworth from the Internet Society and Bob Pepper from Cisco will be our first respondents, provide some reflections on what Scott said, maybe argue with him a little bit, and then we'll turn to you for questions. So Scott Marcus has been at WIK Consult, which is one of the premier telecom consulting firms in Europe. It's based in Bonn so that they can whisper in the ears of telecom regulators and the German government, but they also work with other governments across Europe. They do a lot of work with the European Parliament and the European Commission. Prior to joining WIK back in 2005, Scott was a special advisor for Internet technology at the Federal Communications Commission. Very much a pioneer in defining some of the important Internet policy issues that we'll face. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott and his slides. And again, be thinking of good questions because we do have a lot of time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that absolutely lovely introduction. And thanks to Microsoft for hosting. And thanks also to my panelists, and thanks to the audience for being here. Always good to start with thanks. Now, what I'm going to be covering today is a wide range of issues on what, as we all know, is a very complex and a very multifaceted topic. A bit about definitions of network neutrality, why does it raise concerns, what harms are known to date, technological and also economic background, but my main focus will be on differences between the European Union and the United States. And there I'll be focused not only on regulatory differences, but also on market differences and even competition law differences. In many cases, these policy differences are results of market differences, and in some cases, they're causes. In some cases, maybe the causality flows both ways. So that's really what I'll be trying to walk through today. The slides are, of course, going to be available, and also many of the same thoughts are available in some of my other published work. I've left some pointers at the back of the presentation to help you track some of that down, including, by the way, a study for the European Parliament in 2011, which I am right in the middle of updating for them even as we speak. That's why I happened to be in town, was to interview the FCC. So with that said, let's move into the discussion. And what is network neutrality? And I think a key observation here would be that there are many different definitions that have made the rounds. Ability of all Internet users to access applications, contents, is not...
Can you clip the microphone on your tie a little, as high as
Okay.
you can? Yeah. There we go.
Okay.
Right at the vocal cords.
Is this better?
Perfect.
Bingo. Okay, thank you very much for catching me early. Good. Okay, so one definition would be ability of all Internet users to access content, applications, what have you. Another would be assurance that all Internet traffic is treated equally, irrespective of its source or its content or its destination. A third would be the absence of unreasonable discrimination. All of these have appeared in regulatory proceedings. All of them have appeared in the literature. What people often miss is that the definitions are not exactly equivalent and that they also don't have exactly equivalent implications for public policy as well. Now, many people think of this as a new issue that sort of sprang from nowhere, but in fact, these issues have been around. I was debating much the same issues in the late 1990s. These are really slightly new manifestations of issues that have been there. And also worth noting is that quality differentiation in the Internet, which is really what a lot of these issues are about, is not a new phenomenon. There never was a general principle that all bits have to be treated equally. Quality differentiation has its research roots in the Internet in the 1970s. There were production services for the military in the 90s and the 2000s. It's been around for a while. And in most cases, the differentiation actually benefits not only the service providers, but also the consumers, also the users, in most but not all circumstances. So I think these are good, perhaps, themes that I'd like to lay out from the outset, and from there move into maybe some of the details. Why do we worry about these things? The biggest issues are economic, and they relate to competitive behavior or anti-competitive behavior. But potential breaches have also raised concerns about everything from freedom of expression, inhibiting innovation, consumer awareness, privacy. A lot of different things have been raised. Some of them are easier for us to deal with than others. My particular background is a little mixed. My degrees were political science and engineering. I work a lot as an economist. It's a multifaceted problem, and you have to tackle it from more than one angle, I think, to get a comprehensive view. A general observation would be, though, that these issues are not simple. They are not single-sided, and that a simplistic solution could easily do more harm than good. That's why we need to think them through. On the technology side, the issue is at some level easy to express. There are a few parameters of Internet traffic that determine what kind of quality the user is going to see. They range from the bandwidth available, queuing delays, that's the amount of time that traffic spends in waiting lines, propagation delay, which is speed of light delay. It's actually a big factor in total. Thank goodness not a large factor in these discussions about net neutrality. Packet loss, also an important consideration. So these are the technical levers that we have to deal with. But more important for the average user isn't really the technical parameters. The key question is, what's the end user's quality of experience? What's the quality that they perceive when they're using an application? And that perception is heavily dependent on the nature of the application itself. So obviously for email, we perfectly happily tolerate quite substantial delays. The area where we have the biggest issues with quality tend to be where we have bidirectional communications. Those of you that have a few gray hairs like me will remember talking over the Atlantic when we mostly did it by satellite with 270 milliseconds up and down speed of light delay. The problem was both sides would start talking at once. Now, the perceived delay in bidirectional communications is a function both of average delay and of variability of delay. Both play a role. But for that reason, when you have bidirectional communications, it's really important to bound the average and the variability of delay, the jitter. So those issues come up. Now, in video, it may or may not be a delay. Most people assume that all video is delay sensitive. Not really true. A YouTube has relatively little dependency on variability of delay. Also a Netflix. It's important that the traffic get through at reasonable performance, but as long as the user can tolerate a second or two of delay at the outset, variability can be dealt with by buffering on the receiving side. The case where it really becomes important for video is either if you're doing bidirectional video, where you have very much the same considerations as with bidirectional voice, or where the user expects the same kind of zapping time that they would get on, let's say, a conventional television, where you want to be able to change the video programming and see an instant response. In most cases, for video on demand, the variability of delay is much less sensitive than most people assume. So with video, it means some video you care about it a lot, some video you care less. I wouldn't say you don't care, but you care less. And how much of the traffic is involved? Well, this is data. I'm very happy that Robert Pepper is here. This is, of course, from the Cisco VNI, which we all know and hopefully all love. And as you can see, managed IP video and internet video represent a very large fraction of traffic. Now, the amount of traffic that voice over IP represents was shown on some of the earlier graphs from the VNI. At this point, they don't bother to show it because it's so small that you can barely see it. And this is important to remember. Voice over IP and voice generally is a low bandwidth service. Video is a high bandwidth service and represents a large fraction of the total traffic. So for that portion of the video where we really care about the performance, this is a big deal. And this, of course, is why companies like Netflix have been very much in the middle of these discussions. Most of the time, performance could reasonably be expected to be pretty good. Not all of the time, but most of the time. This is classic queuing theory. I wrote a book on data network design years ago when I was working more as an engineer. These days I do more as an economist. And here you see a family of curves based on how variable the length distribution of the packet traffic is, classic queuing theory. And you'll note that for 1.2, which at that point was a pretty standard coefficient of variation for this traffic, that the delays would be on the order of, let's say, 100 to 150 microseconds per hop over the internet. Microseconds, even at loads of 90%. This is traffic load from 10% to 90%. Now, what we know from voice calls over the Atlantic is when delays get up in the 150 to 200 millisecond range, that's when you have issues where people start talking at once because they don't know the other side started. The implication here would be that if all hops are loaded not more than, let's say, 90%, you're very unlikely to hit those levels. So where's the problem? The problem is, first, that the network operator may have misdesigned the network. One overloaded hop and you're dead. The curve goes up without an upper bound. The second is, of course, that internet traffic is bursty. And so there are periods of time, even in a well-designed network, where it's likely to be overloaded. If you've got one bad hop, that has far more impact than hundreds of good hops. So the delays do matter for delay-sensitive services. Okay, let's talk a little about the economic background on net neutrality. To my mind, there are three main strands of economic thought that play in here. The first is quality and price differentiation. The second is economic foreclosure. The third is the theory of two-sided markets. And these different theories have rather different implications once again. They're not necessarily incompatible, but they have different implications on what public policymakers should be doing. Now, for quality differentiation and price differentiation, this is the same economic theory that talks about first and second class tickets on trains and first class and economy class on airplanes. The economic theory has been around for a long time. It has its roots in the 19th century. One of the best papers is Hoteling in 1929. It's pretty well understood that network operators get some benefit out of this, that producers get benefit, but in most cases, quality differentiation also benefits consumers, also benefits the user of the service. So that's kind of a first strand, and this one would be a relatively benign interpretation of these neutrality issues. The second is a newer strand that talks about two-sided markets. And this has especially its roots in the work from a number of economists at the Institut d'économie industrielle in Toulouse. The paper that I usually reference is the one by Tirole and Rocher in 2004. Here the idea is that there can be a platform that pulls together two sides of a market. And in such a system, the economics that operate could be quite different from those that hold in a normal one-sided economic setting. For example, in broadcast over-the-air television, consumers typically pay nothing or next to nothing, whereas advertisers on the production side pay the total amount. Now, for consumers to pay nothing in a classical economic view seems a little strange. How can it make sense for them to pay less than the incremental marginal cost? But what two-sided market theory tells us is it can make sense if it brings the two sides of the market together. And this has to be understood in terms not only of subscription characteristics, the number of people who basically use the service, but also in usage characteristics, how and how much they use the service. So the platform makes its money by pulling people together. An analogous case that's often cited in the literature is singles bars. How can it be logical for a singles bar to offer free drinks to females on Thursday nights? If it brings the right mix together, it can be profitable, even if it means that they're offering a product or service at less than their short-range marginal cost in the near term. So that's what it tells us. And in this case, if we see, for example, disputes between, say, or rather, if we see usage by multiple providers, for example, Google, Yahoo, Bing, different search engines, through the internet and to the user, many of the arguments that are possible here are not necessarily problematic. They're really an understandable disagreement about how to split up the surplus in one of these platform arrangements. An important distinction is that in this case, it's the internet as a whole that's a platform, not an individual provider. This is rather different from many of the other two-sided markets that are discussed. And an important distinction then is the internet service provider serving the end user is not necessarily the same as the one that's serving the content or application provider, and the interests of these two providers are not necessarily aligned. Keep in mind also, in some cases, the provider of the service may itself be integrating both functions. A company like Google, in effect, is its own ISP and is comparable in many respects to the largest of commercial ISPs. Okay, a third strand of economic theory is that of economic foreclosure, vertical foreclosure. Here the concern is when you have firms operating in vertically related markets, or especially one firm that operates in two vertically related markets, if it has market power in one piece and also operates in a vertically related piece that would otherwise be competitive, it will often be motivated to try to project the market power into the vertically related segment that ought to be competitive. Now, that's one where the economic theory would say that's generally bad, and this is the one that's often showed up in the literature as a concern. The idea here would be if a network operator had power over the last mile and could somehow project that into application spaces where it either operated itself or had affiliations. Let's say a network operator has a linkage to a bookseller. They might try to crowd out other booksellers. This is the one that's unambiguously bad. The two-sided markets isn't necessarily bad. The quality differentiation probably is beneficial. So the net conclusion here would be that the kind of deviations that you really worry about depend to a substantial degree on presence of market power, I would argue. And for that reason, much of the approach in Europe has been predicated on the belief that you can make this kind of problem much less likely if you reduce market power, and as a related matter, if you can reduce switching power between alternative providers, switching costs between alternative providers, and ensure that consumers are fully and fairly informed so that they can switch if something is happening that they don't like. And this really is a lot of the driver in the current European approach. It's a recognition that regulations to strictly control network neutrality would be difficult, and that it's better instead to make problematic deviations, let's say, from net neutrality as unlikely as possible. Now, let's talk for a minute about some of the differences between Europe and the United States. And those can be viewed in terms primarily of market structure, regulatory framework, and also applicability of competition law. In terms of market, as the FCC actually noted in its Open Internet NPRM, the United States in many respects could be viewed as a series of duopolies. Any individual consumer usually has two real choices of fixed network internet. One telecoms company and one cable company. In Europe, we have a rather different situation. There were competitive remedies applied to last mile fixed networks in the United States. They were largely eliminated in the period 2002 to 2005, as we'll see. Mobile broadband widespread, the degree to which it's a substitute rather than a complement can be debated, but you have a different competitive situation than you do in Europe. You have competition primarily between platforms rather than within them. And in terms of the amount of competitive broadband, these are the simple statistics from the FCC. They haven't been reporting these for many years now, but after the '96 Act came into play and once it became effective, there was a small growth. It peaked at, let's say, 6% of all DSL lines provided by CLECs, competitive operators. Once the regulatory climate changed, it declined. At this point, it's small enough that there would really be no point in reporting. It's well under 2%. It's probably well under 1%. So it means that you've got basically no competition within the telecom network. It's a bit less necessary in the United States than in Europe. One can argue this, but a key difference is in Europe, lots of households have access to cable. So many households have a second wire. In Europe, cable has only 55% coverage. There's some member states in Europe that have nearly full coverage. The Netherlands, Belgium, Malta. There are some member states in Europe that have none, like Greece and Italy. So you've got a quite different situation. But for telecom networks, this is the fraction of DSL services provided by incumbents. And it's a very different picture. 45%, according to current statistics from the European Commission, 45% of DSL lines are provided by competitors. So there are alternatives even with a single wire to the home. And more importantly, there's not just one alternative. In most member states, there are many. So most Europeans, even though they're dependent on the network operator's physical line, do have some real choice on how that line is managed. There is somewhere else to go. If we look at the discussion a moment ago about vertical foreclosure, for there to be meaningful competitive pressure, there have to be meaningful competitors. Competition law, I'll spend only a few words on, but again, it's a very different situation in Europe versus the United States. In Europe, competition law is seen as an explicit complement to telecom regulation. Telecom regulation operates before the fact, it's ex ante. Competition law is after the fact, it's ex post. It means that European authorities effectively get two bites at the apple in dealing with these issues, potentially. In the US, that second bite at the apple is almost completely precluded through a number of court decisions that some of you will know. They have names like Trinco and Goldwasser. Okay, now on the regulatory side, again, the key issues, I'll spend some time on this, but I'll try to move through this quickly because our real focus here is Europe. I think most of you will be aware that in the US you have a very important conceptual distinction between telecommunication services and information services. A wide range of regulatory remedies are applied to those who provide telecommunication services. Almost no obligations are placed on those that provide information services. Initially, that enabled the US FCC to avoid regulating the internet core. That's a good thing. Over the years, a lot of things were deregulated, and whether that makes sense is something that can be argued. There are many precedents in the United States, and to my mind, some of the most important relate to the so-called computer inquiries. This was a set of decisions that the FCC made, many of them in the 1970s. This is not new stuff. The key question was, would the Bell system be allowed to offer computer time-sharing services? And the key elements of the decision were, yes, because services running over the network should be available on a competitive basis, there wouldn't be barriers of entry, as long as underlying basic services were available to all on non-discriminatory terms. So that was the logic. The same decision, on the one hand, chose to enable the Bell system to offer over-the-top services, but on the other hand, ensured that the underlying basic services would be available. Now, that was codified in 1996 and used a different set of terminology, but captured the same exact ideas. But the underlying logic got lost a little bit, and so the deregulatory decisions lumped last-mile broadband services in, I would argue, without taking proper cognizance of whether there could be market dominance issues on the last mile, which really had been the key basis for the original computer inquiry decisions. Okay, so what's the history? Well, as many of you will know, there was an FCC broadband policy statement, said that consumers should be entitled to access services of their choice, applications, choice of legal devices, and competition among network operators. So that was the thrust, but it's a policy statement. And there was no specific enforcement mechanism. There's no real proceeding. What it really represented was the opinions of the particular commissioners that were in office at the time, none of whom, by the way, are in office today. We've got a number of cases subsequently. A few of you may know about Madison River. I'll skip it in the interest of brevity. But you've also got the Comcast case where Comcast was accused of blocking peer-to-peer traffic. I think worsened their own case somewhat by issuing conflicting statements on what they were doing and why. Agreed to end the practice, but also took the FCC to court, arguing that the FCC didn't have authority to act. And the courts agreed. So the Commission in 2010 had to reach a decision what to do about this, if anything. Do they exit the field? Do they declare Internet services to be a service subject to regulation and then exempt regulations that seemed inappropriate? This was something that was given serious consideration by the then FCC Chairman, Genikowski. Or try to find authority to act somewhere else, even though their previous decisions had basically put Internet services of all kinds into an unregulated category. And after a lot of thought, they chose the latter, created a rule that establishes transparency, establishes no blocking for both fixed and mobile services, and for fixed services only, also a rule about no unreasonable discrimination. So, challenge in the courts, Verizon versus FCC. The court decision was the FCC can implement rules using the authority in Section 706, which is a part of the '96 Act that talks about getting broadband deployed, but they can't do exactly what they did the way they did it. I'll save us all, I think, from a long lawyerly discussion here. But the FCC ultimately took the offer that the court gave them, said, well, you do have authority to do something here, and have issued a notice of proposed rulemaking where what they propose to do is to put substantially the same rules from 2010 in place using a somewhat different basis. So that's where we stand today. And there's some interesting things in that also are relevant to the discussion about differences between Europe and the United States. One is that they take the position that network neutrality issues don't depend critically on market power. Now, I think it's easy to see why they would want to do that. It's hard for them to prove market power. Again, I would argue on the economics that probably the issues that you care most about probably do depend on market power, but be that as it may, they recognize, I think rightly, a largely duopolistic character in the United States broadband markets, or rather a series of non-overlapping duopolies. Key issue here, they didn't get to network interconnection. Some of the commercial parties would have liked them to. They decided to treat that as a battle for another day. It's clearly a related issue. It's not the same issue. Worth noting is the 2010 issue didn't deal with interconnection either. So the current NPRM, if it were implemented exactly as the proposed line of reasoning states, would merely reestablish the status quo ante. It's not really a change. Much of the press has described this as if it were a radical transition of the US market. It's basically simply exactly where they were before. So that's what we're talking about differences from. How is Europe different? Well, it's a lot different. European regulation has been harmonized since 2002, 2003. Harmonized isn't quite the same as uniform, but it means that all of the 28 countries, 28 member states of the European Union, and a few hangers-on as well, operate under the same rules. They implement those rules slightly differently because there are differences in their markets, but they operate under a general common regulatory framework, and that mostly works. Now, that framework is technologically neutral. That means that Internet is not different in Europe than switch networks. And by the way, this is true of almost all the world. The United States is actually the oddball here. It's the United States that treats these as being radically different. Now, we have, of course, a very strong rhetoric, don't regulate the Internet. Does this mean that Europe regulates the heck out of the Internet? Well, I would argue not really. They achieve a deregulatory outcome in a different way. The reason, for example, that Internet interconnection isn't regulated is that regulation, at least a certain flavor of economic regulation, is there to address competition issues, a specific range of competition issues, and it's perceived that Internet interconnection generally isn't subject to market power, generally. Therefore, since there was no market dominance problem, there was no need to regulate it. So they achieve pretty much the same outcome, but without putting Internet in a separate bucket. And that's important. It also means that in Europe, the entire debate about what to do with the public switched network as it converts from switched to Internet has been almost a non-issue. There are a few details that have to get sorted out, but there's no discussion that the transition from switched to Internet would result in wide-scale deregulation. It's simply not a discussion. It also means, by the way, that there's no discussion as to whether the regulatory authorities have action to deal with net neutrality issues. It's fairly obvious, I think, to all Europeans that a communications regulatory authority has the authority to regulate communications, whether they're Internet or not. So it's a very different debate in Europe than in the United States. Is my audio still good? Yep. Okay, good. Now, I talked before about the importance of competition. And again, there are several flavors of pro-competitive remedies that are introduced through European regulation. And as we've seen, they mostly work. The regulatory framework was introduced in 2002 to introduce competition into an industry that hadn't yet been liberalized. And I would argue that it's mostly done its job. So as a result, you have meaningful choices. There are three main areas where changes to the framework in Europe were introduced in order to strengthen protection of net neutrality. The first was to introduce a specific regulatory goal into the framework as a whole. Those of you who know the European framework, it's Article 8 of the Framework Directive. And it essentially reads a lot like the FCC's broadband policy statement. It says that users should be free to access applications, content, services of their choice. It doesn't have operative language associated with it, but think of it as having an effect similar to serving as a basis for ancillary authority under Title I in the United States. It provides a basis for action in cases where there isn't an explicit provision in the framework. The second is probably the most important concrete measure, and that was to require providers of electronic communications networks and services to make their customers aware of their practices in regard to traffic management, blocking, and so on, and also to make them aware of any changes. If the network operator announces a change and the consumer isn't satisfied with it, the consumer has two choices. They can either ask to be, well, they can request being under the old provisions, they aren't guaranteed to get it, or they have a right to cancel their contract without penalty. So this clearly addresses a couple of the necessary preconditions for consumer choice to be effective. The users have to be informed, and they've taken concrete measures to lower switching costs in order to make those protections effective. So that's been the real second line of defense. The first line of defense against problems with network neutrality in Europe was simply to ensure that competition exists on the last mile in the first place. This is a second line. Seems to be reasonably effective. A third was put in place. It's a power for national regulatory authorities to impose, if necessary, limitations on quality of service. The concern here was that service providers offering better service quality is not a problem. For service providers to degrade some service below the level where it's usable could be a problem, or to somehow crowd out best efforts internet service. So that's what this provision is intended to ensure. It's never been exercised. I'd say the national regulators hope that it will never be exercised because it would be pretty tricky to implement. It's not clear what those thresholds ought to be. But the capability is there. In terms of jawboning operators where there's a problem, it's an important threat, let's say. And so it's there as a fallback provision. It's in the European level acts and therefore has been placed in national law in the member states, in the members of the European Union. Now, a natural question is, how often have there been problems and what kind of problems have there been? And this is something that I think is a little bit misunderstood. The FCC's own NPRM talks about common blocking problems in Europe, and there are blocking problems in Europe. We know a bit from the survey results. Eurobarometer, statistics produced by the for the European Commission, come out with reports annually on consumer views. In the 2013 report, as in 2011, they found that a substantial fraction of Europeans thought they'd probably been blocked at some time. Probably had been blocked at some time. That may mean only once, you don't know. But the question is, why did they think they were blocked? And here I would contend that it's a more complex reality than most people want to acknowledge. Of those who have been blocked, this is out of those who think they've been blocked at least once, about 31% thought they'd been blocked by the internet connection provider, which is the case that we really care about in these network neutrality discussions. An almost equal number believed they'd been blocked by the content provider. 19% thought they'd been blocked because of geographical copyright restrictions. There's also a 9% who thought that their mobile device had been the cause of blocking. So there's a number of different causes of blocking. It's a complicated reality. Some people will very cheerfully make the statement that all blockage is bad. I would contend that blocking, as well as degradation, are complicated problems that themselves have many facets and probably aren't adequately understood. As it happens, by the way, BEREC has a study going on right now. It's just starting to try to get a better grasp of European consumer attitude towards net neutrality. I'm happy to report that my company has the honor of having won that project. So, stay tuned. We may know a little bit more. But I would say, again, it's an area that's been underappreciated, and like everything else here, it's darn complex. Now, there isn't a single view about net neutrality in Europe any more than there's a single view about net neutrality in the United States. But I talk a lot to the regulators, and the regulators, through their joint group, BEREC, publish pretty extensively on this. And this is how I would characterize the mainstream view among regulators, not necessarily among the general public. It's first that problematic network neutrality deviations continue to be pretty rare in Europe in general. It's that there's mostly not a systematic problem. There are one or two specific areas that are problematic. One of the ones that's most often quoted and that I personally view as a real problem is blockage of voice over IP over the mobile network from handsets. That's one where clearly all the mobile operators have a common interest in making things a little harder. So no systematic problem, but a few areas where action could be warranted. Most of the regulators would argue that the tools they already have, between those in the 2003 framework and those that they were given in 2009, are up to the job that they've been handed. Yep. Did I miss one? No, there we go. Now, as many of you are aware, there were a new set of proposals put forward in September of 2013, the so-called Connected Continent proposals. And they dealt with a lot of things. They dealt with how do companies become service providers. They dealt with spectrum management. They dealt with this. They dealt with that. The Commission was ostensibly trying to achieve a more uniform single market for electronic communications in Europe. But in fact, many of the measures had more to do with trying to strengthen the role of the European Commission itself relative to the member states. The package really was not the best work that the Commission has produced. Yeah, well, I got a chuckle out of it. It's sad but true.
Or they didn't hire you to do it.
Yeah, that's right. See, if they'd hired me, they would have got. Well, in fact, the Parliament hired me to give a critique. So these days, I tend to do more work for the European Parliament than I do for the European Commission. And unfortunately, thanks to that report, perhaps it'll stay that way. We'll see. Okay. Anyway, so they were trying to get a number of things here. Now, for net neutrality, there are several pieces of the Connected Continent that really do make sense. In trying to increase the authority of the European Commission relative to spectrum management, it really does make sense for a couple of reasons that I could cover maybe over a beer later. It's not germane to today's discussion. For net neutrality, the biggest driver was not that more power or authority was needed. Again, it's a different debate in Europe. The network regulatory authorities, national regulatory authorities, have the authority that they need. The concern, rather, was different member states were implementing additional measures beyond what were done at European level, and there was a concern that there would be too much divergence among the member states. There was a law passed in the Netherlands a couple of years ago. There were actions taken in Germany against some proposed changes by Deutsche Telekom that some of us would say were probably reasonably okay. The concern was that we would get a thicket of different regulatory and legal provisions in different member states that would make it very difficult to introduce new services across the European Union. It's a valid concern. Whether the exact text was the right text, one could argue, but it's a legitimate concern. Now, the European Parliament passed, yes, I see Robert's looking up, passed a package that was mostly improved through deletion. However, there were a bunch of, and they improved many of the areas, but they also possibly went too far in some areas. And net neutrality is one of those that has to be, I think, looked at a little carefully. But I'm doing work for the Parliament, so let me not say too much here, but let me point to a few things. One of the areas that's raised a lot of concerns is the definition of network neutrality, that it should be treatment of internet equally without discrimination, restriction, interference, independent of sender, receiver, type, content, device, service, or application. And here in the discussion about services and applications and quality of experience, you'll recall there's some applications that really would benefit from different qualities of service. So one has to raise a question here, is there an issue of throwing baby out with bathwater? Now recall, this was a decision, this is a vote taken by the European Parliament. This is not yet a European regulation, but this is the position that the Parliament voted. Okay, another had to do with traffic management and argues that network congestion should be allowed provided that congestion occurs temporarily or in exceptional circumstances. National authorities should be able to require that a provider demonstrates that equal treatment of traffic will be substantially less efficient. Again, as you've seen, there's good technical reasons to argue that some applications need different treatment of quality, and as also observed, traffic is bursty. This may not really be the right thing. Specialized service is another area that's gotten a lot of attention in the press and from the stakeholders, and once again, the question is the definition of a specialized service, which, by the way, has echoes, of course, in US FCC language as well. Is there the risk here that we'll be having networks designed by lawyers instead of by engineers, to the extent that they aren't already being designed by lawyers rather than engineers? So there are questions that have been raised. I don't want to comment too much on what the Parliament is doing, since I'm doing a project for the Parliament, but these are the issues that have been raised. Now, as for what will happen, again, the European Commission is one of three bodies. They propose the text for regulation. The Parliament has, I would argue, improved what the Commission put forward, mostly by deleting 90% of it. But in a couple of areas, there's still questions as to whether what remains is really the right thing to implement. And the third party really hasn't been heard from. And perhaps a particular complexity here is that we've had elections for the European Parliament, and we also have a new European Commission that's just about to be appointed. All we know is the big boss. The head of the relevant part of the Commission isn't set yet. The Director General of that part of the Commission is also due to be phased out momentarily. So there's a lot of uncertainty as to what will actually happen before this actually goes into effect, if anything goes into effect. It may simply suffer a death of 1,000 cuts and nothing at all appear. Okay, so wrapping up, I think I ran a little overlong, but not hugely overlong here. So quality differentiation of internet traffic, I would argue, is welfare enhancing under most, but not all circumstances, and welfare enhancing not only to producers, but also to consumers, to users of the services. That there's a risk that overly prescriptive rules could do more harm than good, that remedies for that reason have to be carefully targeted. That for Europe, really the front line has been and continues to be keeping competition active in mobile networks and on the last mile for fixed networks. A general point I would make that not everybody would agree with is that arrangements between willing parties, between, for example, over-the-top providers and network operators, should probably be assumed to be okay unless shown otherwise. Now, this is something I could have spent time on today and haven't. Again, I'm treating the interconnection issues as being somewhat distinct from net neutrality, but there's a clear linkage, and this has been where many of the issues and the discussions and problems have been. Lastly, that it's pretty tough to draw bright line rules. Last but not least, this risk about fragmented treatment. This is one where the Commission has been worried, and I think is right to be worried, that a fragmented approach across the European Union could be a problem. I'd note, by the way, as maybe one closing observation, we talk about a European Union, but in a lot of ways, the EU is more like what the United States was from the time of the Revolution until the point when the Federal Constitution came into place. It's much more nearly comparable to the United States under the Articles of Confederation, where certain powers were expressly delegated to central authority, but all others were retained by the member states. And in this case, in order to achieve common benefits of a union, there probably is a need for some greater coordination than is available under the existing instruments. Okay, and with that said, this is a pointer to some other things, most of them mine. I also have a pointer to the two-sided market papers. With that, I'm happy to hand off. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Scott. I think you can all see why so many of us are members of the Scott Marcus fan club. That was not only clear economics, it was also clear technology, and he did it all in about 40 minutes. So Scott and Bob and Sally, if you can join us up here. This is where we get into a little interaction. I mentioned earlier we have a couple of respondents to sort of pick apart some of the arguments and to look a little deeper at the differences between what the European Union is doing. But before I turn it over to Sally, let me do a little commercial for the Internet Society, which she's a member of. The Internet Society, as you know, was founded more than 20 years ago, initially to oversee the development of the key standards that have led to the success of the Internet, the work of the Internet Engineering Task Force. But the Internet Society is also playing a critical role in many countries around the world in shaping the debate over Internet policy, helping policymakers understand how the Internet works and how they can make it work better. The local chapters in countries around the world are part of that process, and we have a very active chapter here in DC. Those of you who are actively involved in the chapter, put your hands up. Right here in front is David Viorst and Judith Hellerstein, two of our key members of the group. And if you have questions about how you can get more involved, please talk to them or talk to me afterwards. We're also doing a happy hour 2 weeks from today, 6:30 at the Science Club. It's where all the geeks go to drink. 6:30 on Wednesday, August 20th. So please join us there if you can. It's always a fun discussion. We never know who shows up, and we never know what's discussed, but it's always interesting. So let me now turn to Sally Shipman-Wentworth. She is the Vice President for Global Policy Development at the Internet Society here in Washington.
Thanks. Let's see. Am I on here? Oh, good. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming out this evening, and thanks to Scott for a very good talk. I think some of the things that were brought out in the discussion here relate, as Mike said, to both the issues faced in the U.S. and Europe in trying to deal with the issues of net neutrality, but also as this discussion becomes a much more global one on how do you actually bring about an open internet and what is the role of technology and policy and economics in bringing about that future that we all say we want. I think one of the comments that I particularly liked in the presentation is that there really is no one agreed definition of what net neutrality is, which when you get into a multi-country discussion of the topic adds a whole layer of complexity to the debate and what we're actually talking about. We saw that, I think, more recently in Brazil at the Net Mundial meeting, which was a big international event discussing a range of internet issues, among them net neutrality. And I think some of the trickiness of dealing with that topic was a baseline question of what we were even talking about in that instance. From the Internet Society's perspective, as Mike said, we are a global organization looking at how to grow the internet. Fundamentally, it's a question of how to get more of the internet deployed in countries around the world. And the complexity that we saw in the US and in Europe in dealing with these issues, as you can imagine, for the Internet Society, gets multiplied by the 100+ countries that we work in. So rather than focusing at ISOC on a specific regulatory tool or a specific policy tool that one might use, we try to focus on sort of the outcome that we're trying to achieve. So, and I think a lot of that is evident in some of what we hear from the European and American policymakers of where they're trying to get to. We want an internet where consumers can access the content and applications, the lawful content and applications of their choosing. We want an environment that's competitive, where users have the ability to choose among a range of providers with real choice and the real ability to switch if they're not satisfied. We want transparency in the relationship between the consumer and their provider in terms of what the network management rules might be. We also understand, though, from a very core technical perspective, that there is a role for network management in our lives, in our interaction with the networks. But that needs to be done in a way that's not anti-competitive, that's not discriminatory, that actually gives users the kind of choice and the kind of transparency in the relationship that they expect. But I do think it's important as the discussion goes global, as it emerges beyond the US and beyond Europe, that we recognize that market structures are very different in countries, that they're very complex. They have to take into account years of commercial activity, years of development, and the solution that works here in the United States or that works in Europe, either as an entity or as 28 member states, is going to be different than what we see emerge in Brazil, that just took action to consider net neutrality as part of their internet policy framework. So from our perspective, as an organization that can't get into the nitty-gritty of every regulatory action around the globe, as much as we might like to, it's really looking at what does this look like from a user-centric perspective, and what are the principles, and what is the internet experience that we want to see for users around the world. Regardless of which technology they're accessing, from how do we ensure that the experience is one that's based on competition, transparency, openness, and the ability to actually access and benefit from a whole range of applications that they want access to. So that's how we approach it, and I think as we consider the Q&A, one of the questions I might ask Scott is, if you took your experience in Europe and you made it global, are there some key principles or takeaways that might be generalizable beyond US and beyond Europe?
So why don't we wait and let Bob Pepper comment. Bob is the Vice President for Technology Policy at Cisco. His fan club is almost as large as Scott's. I had the pleasure of working...
Larger.
Larger? Okay.
I'm a member.
I'm a member too. I had the pleasure of working with Bob way back when in the 90s at the FCC, back when we were first trying to figure out how not to regulate the internet. So Bob, over to you.
Thanks. It's kind of embarrassing.
The halo is embarrassing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But what I was going to say is that one reason it was always great working with Scott when you use Commission these days, you mean the European Commission.
That's right.
And I use it, I have to define, because I work with both. Actually, I work more with the European Commission than the Federal Communications Commission. But when we were at the FCC together, your really clear-headed, analysis based upon both technology and economics actually help lead to good decisions. And I really, really liked your presentation and the framework because it pulls back to sort of a first principle question. Is there a problem? If there is a problem, what is it? And then diagnosing if there's a problem and we can identify it, how do we solve it? And I think that's the way. I mean, that leads to really good decision making. In some of the earlier, and I think that was done in some of the earlier FCC decisions and the attempts by the Commission here to do that. But because of the idiosyncratic way in which the Title 47 is written and constructed, right? Remembering that the 96 Telecommunications Act was really an amendment to a 1934 Communications Act, which was an amalgamation of the 1927 Radio Act with new telecom parts, and we talk about it as the FCC is a converged regulator, and it is, but we still have the silos, right, and among the titles. So that's a constraint. But what I want to do is, because I spend more time focusing on Europe, and this is really about Europe, is focus a little bit on your comments about Europe. I couldn't agree more about the context and the analysis in Europe. And I find it very instructive that it's not just BEREC. BEREC is the group of national regulatory authorities in Europe. It's not a trade association like NERUC, but it's actually, it's empowered by the European Commission. And it's the group of all of the what they call the NRAs, the National Regulatory Authorities. And when they've analyzed and looked at the issue, the 3 points that Scott made, I think, were absolutely correct. One, the problem in Europe is rare, but there is a systematic exception to that rarity, and it is blocking of voice over IP. One reason for that, if you think about it, is the sort of, and if you're looking at anti-competitive behavior, to be oversimplified, not to be very careful here because Stan Bessen's in the room, who always, correct me. But you have to be, really both have the incentive and the ability to act in an anti-competitive way. When it comes to the mobile voice operators in Europe, because of the calling party pays structure instead of the bill and keep regime we have in the U.S., the incentive to block voice over IP in the U.S. because I'm already buying because of the way in which the large baskets of minutes, or even now the way my mobile operator here sells me my mobile service as a data plan for 5 devices and tells me voice is free. They don't care because of the structure of the market, and there is no tax on them, with a little t in quotes, for me to make a call or for somebody to call me. Because if somebody calls me, there's not this termination pricing because of the bill and keep regime. So we had big baskets of minutes. So if I'm using voice over IP domestically, there's no gain and there's no loss of revenue to the operator. Whereas in Europe, very different. So the incentives, as well as that ability, for the European mobile operators to block voice over IP because it was a clear revenue loss. Right? Very, very different. Again, goes back to the market incentives, the market structure, the economics, follow the money. Right? So, a sort of back of the envelope diagnosis of why is there that systematic problem, and it is a problem. There should not be blocking.
Yes.
Period. But the third point also is that given the framework in Europe, the national regulatory authorities basically feel as though they have tools if and when a problem actually arises, they have tools to address that in an ex post way, not just through new ex ante regulation. And that might someday be the case in the US, but again, going back to the court cases, the Comcast case, et cetera, given the way the 96 Act, the 34 Act was constructed, title, Section 706, and the way it was applied in a specific set of facts, created the issue for the FCC. I would take a little bit of issue, not a lot, about your narrative on the Commission versus the Parliament versus Council and the following. The Commission, in terms of its early considerations and the recommendations from the staff, were basically tracking the same provisions or the same analysis that BEREC has, right? There are existing tools, it's not a big problem, and when it arises, we can address it. What happened was that the Commission's proposal to Parliament for legislation as part of this broader package got wrapped up in election year campaigning and politics, right? And this is something that we all know, that when you move from the expert agency that's developing policy and analysis based upon facts, right, and doing good analysis, when that moves into a political arena with elected officials in an election year, funny things can happen. In fact, that's why they call election years the silly season. So that the proposal that ended up coming out of the Commission was not where it started, was actually quite extreme in many ways. And to the extent that Parliament improved it, it's not absolutely, I mean, yes, there were improvements, but as you pointed out, and you, again, recitals 45 and 47 and Article 6 really did provide significant constraints that you point out to the appropriate ability to manage networks when needed. But the fundamental principles, no blocking, consumers have the right to connect devices, consumers have the right to access, download, and use any legal content, applications, et cetera, are there. But just one little example of the problem with the legislation that passed Parliament was up there in Article 6, you can't have any network management, and they list all of these things, except if there is exceptional and temporary congestion. Right? But what we know is that based upon the way people use video on the internet, the internet is now the new prime time for video. So every night there's a peak hour, and peak hour traffic is 3 times average hour traffic. So it's not only, and it lasts during prime time. So it's not only temporary, and it's not exceptional, but because it is predictable, you actually can have network management and make sure that it's not either anti-competitive or anti-consumer. So it's unfortunate that the legislation, as it passed Parliament, had some of these things in there that I think were counterproductive, even though there's wide agreement about these fundamental principles. Last point about the quibble on the Parliament. Since there's an election and a new Parliament, they have to start over. So it's just like a new Congress, just like when we're in the next Congress. But what Parliament passed is the baseline. And that's going to be where the debate and the discussion starts. We'll have to see what the new commission structure looks like, who's going to be in charge of that directorate. And we don't know. And then what happens when it hits council. Maybe one last thing to pick up on Sally's point. When we were at Net Mundial in Brazil, and it was absolutely clear that different people were using the phrase net neutrality in so many different ways that it really didn't mean, and you had some of the examples, it didn't mean the same thing, and it was not a particularly satisfying conversation because people were talking past one another instead of talking about what they agreed on, identifying problems. And what came out of Net Mundial actually, I think, was a really important shift. Instead of using the phrase net neutrality in principles, the phrase open internet was used as a principle. And then in a second document, it was unpacked. What does open internet mean? And there were 5 elements to the open internet. Sally mentioned, I think, 4 of them, right? Consumer choice, meaningful transparency, or 3 of them, and competition. But there were, and also appropriate network management that was, actually could be pro-consumer and pro-competitive instead of anti-competitive, anti-consumer. But there was but there was a precursor to that in the debate at Net Mundial, which we tend to not focus on as much in the United States and in Europe, but it's really important, especially in the developing world. And that is that many, many people in civil society globally, especially in countries with repressive regimes, view this phrase net neutrality as really meaning freedom of expression. Right. It's the ability to have access to, we have the First Amendment. So we're actually very lucky because this is baked into our Constitution. That's not the case in a lot of countries. So especially in countries with repressive regimes, freedom of expression is really essential as a fundamental principle. And they've been talking about net neutrality in that context. So what Net Mundial did is identifying 5 elements for the open internet. Freedom of expression was the first one. Then there was consumer choice, meaningful transparency, competition, and appropriate network management. I think if we have a conversation based around those principles, maybe we can get past bumper stickers and rhetoric and actually come together and actually have positive outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much. You really got the discussion going well. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A, but first I wanted to pick up where both of you left off. They both basically ask you, are there any other principles? Are there any other things that we need to learn from the European Union that we really haven't touched on? I heard get the market structure right. We heard get transparency into the market so consumers can have choice and use choice. But is there anything else besides don't block my Skype that we want the rest of the world following? And do you think people are going to follow what the European Union does? Because they're not going to follow what the U.S. is doing unless they're trying to build their telecom litigation industry.
Well, for the last question, I do work in a lot of the world, not just in Europe. I think there are a lot of corners of the world where European practice is viewed as regulatory best practice. And I think in many parts of the world that's probably a good view. I work at the Vic, but I also teach at the Florence School of Regulation, and I think to me improving practice globally is important, and I think Europe got some of these things pretty much right. The U.S. is in a very fortunate position by virtue of having 2 wires to nearly every household. Very little of the world is in that position, and so I think many of those things have to be handled more nearly the way Europe handles them. To the 5 points out of Net Mundial, I have to say I hadn't followed that at all, so this is extremely useful for me. I think those 5 principles seem to me to be a pretty good basis for having the discussion.
And there's going to be another major discussion in Istanbul at the Internet Governance Forum. Several of us will be there. Bob is going to be part of that discussion. And I think we're going to hear there in several different languages just how confused this debate over net neutrality is. Okay, so time for questions. We do have dozens of people watching this on the webcast. If they have questions, they can use the hashtag ISOC-DC, or they can post it on the chat. Okay. And Paul Brigner is our video expert here from the Internet Society and also does a lot of other important work for them. So, okay, question over here. Not surprising. Introduce yourself. Everyone knows Baron.
Yeah, I'm Baron Sok, and I'm running for the most obnoxious by asking the first question every single time award, and I'm way ahead right now, but just want to make sure. That's right. So Scott, thanks for your presentation. I really appreciated a lot about it, and especially your focus on the advantages of two-sided markets and an economic approach to this. We don't hear enough of that. But you just said something I thought was really important. You said that it's fortunate that the U.S. has 2 wires to the home. It's not an accident. That's not just a thing that just happened. That's part of a deliberate, conscious industrial policy that was undertaken by the New Democrats in the 1990s, and by Bill Kennard in particular, to enable a second pipe to be deployed, and to do it precisely by coming back away from the computer rules, by heading down the very path that Michael Powell eventually completed, by ending the uncertainty about whether Title II would apply, and in particular by ending unbundling. So my question to you, as you compare the experience of US and Europe, because I know that's not true in many European countries, is, so you talked a lot about competition. Every time you talked about it primarily in terms of having competitive resellers rather than facilities-based competition. So my question is, what about the importance of facilities-based competition, both in the US having 2 versus 1, and then also in the US, and by extension, as a lesson for Europe, about enabling other competitors, whether that's wireless or additional fiber competitors, and dealing with the barriers that they've faced. Google Fiber has faced barriers of local red tape, of a lack of smart infrastructure, as in like conduits under the streets that anybody can use, and the fact that in the US, our telecom law only gives you non-discriminatory pole attachment pricing rights, which is really, really important for deployment if you're either a cable provider or a telco. So Google Fiber had to make that, figure that on their own. And in Chattanooga, the electric utility is rolling out broadband because they don't have to deal with the difficulty of negotiating with the electric utility, being the utility itself. So what can we do to get more competition?
Okay, you just beat my record. I always ask 3 questions. You ask 5. Anybody want to take part or all of that series of questions?
Well, I'll take a couple of pieces of it. I don't actually think that you referred to the ending of unbundling as one of the things that made cable possible. I think cable was well on its way to having national coverage long before that happened. In any case, basically you had a cable industry that had fairly full coverage and implemented DOCSIS standards. Largely, it was part of the same process of digitization, the same move from analog to digital cable. It was profitable for them at the same time to make broadband available. So the wire was kind of already there. There are things that can be done to make a second wire more possible, but if we take a global perspective, it's still going to be very limited what can be achieved. One of the new rules that the European Union has been working on was making infrastructure from all kinds of network industries available to any communications network that wants it. sewage, water, you name it. Basically, the idea is that if a communication network operator asks for it, then the operator of any infrastructure has to provide it at a sensible price, and if there's a dispute, it gets sorted out by the telecoms regulatory authority. It's an interesting concept. It seems to me to be promising. But I work in lots of places. I mean, I've done work on universal service in Peru, for example, and in a country like that, trying to get broadband into cities along the coast is straightforward. Trying to get it into the Andes or the jungles beyond is quite a different matter. And here, if we look at ultra-fast broadband, once again, trying to get full coverage to the whole country, and especially trying to get coverage of multiple infrastructures, it's really tough. My company does a lot of regulatory cost modeling. And in Europe, there's a relatively small fraction of the national territory of most member states that could be profitably covered by more than one infrastructure.
Fixed.
Fixed. Fixed. Mobile's a different story. And there, of course, we get into the question, to what extent is mobile a substitute for fixed versus a complement?
Sally, okay. Next question.
Sure. Paul Feldman, Fletcher, Hilton Hildreth. Thank you so much for your presentation. Most informative. I'm wondering if you've put some thought into, and if so, if you can share with us, a comparison of the political dynamic that results in regulation or lack of regulation in Europe versus the United States. So, and by political dynamic, I mean the relationship and the nature of the communication between, on the one hand, the providers, on the second hand, the regulators, and on the third hand, the public.
So you explain the technology and the economics, now explain the politics.
Yeah, well, it's hard to boil it down into 100 words or less, obviously. I would argue, clearly the network operators play a role on both sides of the Atlantic, but I think they are in a less dominant position in Europe than they are here, and also the system is a bit more open to, let's say, populist pressures, but also pro-consumer pressures. Pro-consumer voices are stronger in Europe. I mean, our politics are clearly, well to the left on average of American politics. On American politics scale, I would probably be fairly far left. In European scale, I'm probably center right.
Just putting it in a slightly different way in terms of the question about Scott mentions the operators. What strikes me working globally is that one of the biggest dilemmas facing the traditional telcos globally is how to make a transition from being companies that sold minutes of voice to being broadband companies, mobile companies. I mean, this is a global issue. What's interesting is in the U.S., as I sort of alluded to, after it was many years of struggle, it was really hard. But the U.S. carrier telcos have done that, right? There are sort of 5 assumptions that used to be correct about the telephone world, right? The product was voice. The metric by which you measured it, billed it, and regulated it was the minute. And then based upon incremental costs, the longer you talk, the higher the cost. You had incremental charges. The longer the distance, the higher the cost. So there were long distance charges. And where you were, location made a difference. In an all IP network, right, you're on or off. It's more of a step function. The product is not voice, right? It's connectivity. There's bandwidth is the metric. And the networks tend to be, time, distance, and location insensitive. You're on or off. So and this goes back to my comment also about calling party pays versus bill and keep and the migration that occurred in the U.S. The U.S. operators, right, are selling you data plans, data connections. They've crossed that chasm from being voice companies to broadband companies. Now we can debate about levels of competition and so on, but that is not what you see in most of the world. That shift is really important and dramatic in terms of the ability for companies to migrate to really what is the next generation of providing services. In Europe, the operators are not allowed, well, first of all, a very different culture among the traditional operators. And you can talk about that. But also, the regulatory structure up to date doesn't allow them to make that migration. And this is one of the dilemmas. And by the way, it's not just in Europe, but there are operators globally. It tends to be challengers, tend to be companies that do make that difference and make that shift because they don't have a lot of, legacy. So, Iliad in France built a brand new, there's the press here about what they might want to do in the US. But in France, they built a complete greenfield network that was not burdened by any of the existing structure. And they basically went in and provided broadband more efficiently at lower prices when they got a mobile license. Their pricing structure was completely different and forced everybody else to change pricing. So in Europe, it tends to be the challengers, especially in mobile. In the US, our two largest operators, have made that shift. It was difficult. It took a long time. But it's a different situation. I just don't know whether you want to.
Well, I just had one word on that. That's an interesting analysis, and in fact, I think I agree with it largely. One of the things I've been pushing strongly in Europe, and that a lot of progress has been made on in Europe, was to get the cost of call termination down from ridiculous levels in the past to levels that are low. And the reason, to me, one of the strongest arguments follows from a comment that Andrew Odlyzko, who many of you will know or know of, has made, which is, as long as the usage-based cost is high, prices will tend to be usage-based. When the usage-based cost gets low enough, the consumer preference for flat rates will tend to win out. And my belief is that at this point, the mobile termination rates have been moved down steadily. If they come down to levels, say, down in the below 1 cent range, which seems to be in prospect for a lot of the member states, I think at that point, flat rate plans are likely to predominate that include, for the first time, off-net calls. And at that point, the systems will look much more nearly alike, I hope.
So let's pick up on this question about wireless a little bit, because here in the US, when they passed the first net neutrality rules, they treated wireless differently. The understanding being that spectrum is more limited, there might be occasions when you want to discriminate between traffic. Are we seeing that same differentiation in Europe, or are they trying to have rules that cover everything? And I'm particularly interested in whether they're doing some of these zero rate plans or sponsored data plans where I buy my mobile data plan, but I can use Facebook or Google or some other services without those minutes or those megabits counting against my data plan. This is happening in Africa. It's happening in a number of places around the world. Is that considered part of the net neutrality debate? And are they coming up with different rules for wireless?
Well, in Europe, they haven't had different rules for wireless, and they would tend not to. We would tend not to. Again, because the system is intended as much as possible to be a technologically neutral system. I have to say, Europeans tended to be pretty mystified by the original NPRM, by the original report and order from 2010. If you read that report and order carefully, spectrum scarcity is the thing that got more press play, but equally visible in the rules was also the belief that there was a much more competitive marketplace for mobile services than for fixed, that there was greater consumer choice in the first place. And to me, that represents the stronger basis actually for treating them differently. But again, I would treat it more as a market power differentiation rather than a technology differentiation. As far as the sponsored plans, to be honest, I haven't seen much about that in Europe.
I haven't heard about it in Europe either. I was just curious whether some countries had been experimenting with that, because in Africa, that's seen as a benefit in many cases.
Let me give you, so you asked whether that's related at all to net neutrality.
Well, it is in some people's definition.
Well, no, what happened, an unfortunate case is Chile. So there was Facebook Zero in Chile, geared to low-income people. So, and it's actually kind of funny because people say, I don't need the internet, but I want Facebook. But that's great marketing. So, so there was a plan that was offered by one of the carriers in a deal with Facebook called Facebook Zero, where if you got that, the first page was Facebook, and it was essentially a subsidized device and very low cost, if not free, basic service. It was supported by advertising. But because of the Chile's net neutrality rule, which said there could not be any discrimination, and I don't have the words with me, on services and source and destination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Subtel, the regulator, told the operator that they had to pull that service, which they did, and it created a big controversy because it was designed to get low-income people who could not otherwise afford smartphones. They just had voice GSM phones. This is how they got a subsidized smartphone, and then and this was their only internet connection, and then they were disconnected from the internet.
And they couldn't go on Facebook to complain about it.
Well, yeah. So it actually had an unintended consequence because of the rigidity of the way the rule was written. Again, you've heard me say, I like to say that we should always be avoiding false choices because it's not, I mean, very little of anything is either or, black and white. The question is, how do you, again, pull back, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And there's got to be ways, which is embedded, for example, in the Net Mundial, to have appropriate network management and protect consumer choice and competition, make sure it's not anti-competitive. It's not either or. The question is, how do we make it work for both? And Chile's an unfortunate example.
But I do think, though, there is an important distinction for consumers to understand what is the trade-off here. I mean, you're being sold internet access, but it's Facebook. These are, you're not getting access to the whole.
No, with Facebook Zero, actually, that was the subsidy, was the first screen, but they could go anywhere.
Okay.
So it was not limited to Facebook. It was.
But they had to pay for the minutes to go outside of Facebook.
And do they understand the trade-off that's made in terms of the collection that happens at that?
I mean, that I don't know, but I'm just saying that it's a good example of that can be made to address these questions. It's not turn it off.
Right.
Okay, one last question. The last question is always the hardest. Do we have any questions in the chat? No? Okay.
If either of the commissions, I'm sorry. My name is Greg Allen. I was previously at the FCC working in data. I'm now outside of the FCC, so I guess I will ask the data question. What type of data, when it comes to transparency or market information, should the two commissions be collecting in order to pursue either their current plans or the ability to review what their plans are?
The best question. And if I can add, what data would you want from the carriers to make sure we had the transparency we want into the services they're providing? In other words, what data do you want for your research so you can do, what data don't you have today that would help you do better analysis for the Parliament, for the FCC, for the Germans and everyone else?
Not a 100-word answer, I'm afraid. The text, I think the text from the new Parliament provision includes quite a few pages on what kind of information should be provided to consumers. The current text of the Universal Service Directive, which is the instrument used in Europe, also has a section that deals with that. I guess I would have to say I haven't studied it too much. For me, the data that the European Commission primarily provides, both itself and through its third-party work, is actually quite a good source, and to me is much more comprehensive than anything I can find in the United States. There are three actually main sources that I rely on for the public data. The first one relating to broadband is the European Commission's own data collected through COCOM that contains numbers of subscriptions and a lot of the basic indicators on broadband at a subscription level.
At a subscription level, so that's
Yes.
the key point. It needs to be at a subscription level, not at some larger geographic level.
Well, it's at a geographic level too, but the point is that this is data basically captured from the operators. So this is somewhat analogous to what the FCC is capturing with 477 reporting, which is probably what you're thinking of. But there are other sources as well. For coverage data, that's actually done through a separate data collection through questionnaires issued to the network operators. That's done by consultancy. They do it, I think, for a ridiculously cheap price. I can't imagine how they do it, but they do it. And the data's gotten a lot better over the last few years. So there's fairly good coverage data, distinguishing between basic broadband and fast broadband. And there I would add, you probably want to keep the boundary points on these things somewhat stable over time so that you can do longitudinal studies. There's a third data source that's available from the Commission, and that's through Eurostat. That's survey data. And there you get information about numbers of subscriptions. To some extent it overlaps, but it's not only useful as a cross-check, it's also that in the absence of that survey data, you really have no way to know how many people are using 1, 2, 3 services. How many people, for example, only have a mobile phone and not a fixed? You're not going to get that out of the subscription data only. Now, an area where, in my judgment, not nearly enough data is systematically captured, well, I would like to say by anybody, but certainly one that I feel the lack of in terms of public data sources has to do with price characteristics. The way that's usually done is through things like price baskets, or, for example, a survey that shows all the pricing plans. But it's never terribly useful because there's huge numbers of plans. Simply knowing what plans are in the market doesn't tell you how many people have each plan. Simply knowing which plans are in the market doesn't tell you how they're used. The typical baskets done by firms like Telegen on behalf of the European Commission or the OECD or occasionally others, they don't really give you that. They only give you the plans. They may give you 3 of the most interesting plans, but you have no way of knowing if they're the most interesting. For econometrics, the data is absolutely useless. Often the actual trends run counter to the data.
Okay, so we have a follow-up question to the question, and then I'm going to ask each of you to have one more chance to.
It's not so much a follow-up question, but actually an answer to yours. The biggest thing we don't know right now is what is actually causing congestion on the network itself. And we don't have good measurement there. Dave Clark at MIT and others, I mean, we say that there is a problem, but where is it? Is it just cat videos or what?
I think that's a great point. So if it's worth it, do you think that the commissions should have access to some type of data which provides instrumentation about the congestion?
It's a good question. Well, for me, for the kind of work I do, I always want more data. And I think I also have to say, in fairness, there's a cost with capturing that data, and the cost isn't only to the entity that's issuing questionnaires. The cost is also to network operators and others that have to do the work.
Although now we have these mobile apps that we can download, and we can,
So there's a,
like MLabs does it for free, right?
So
Just
there's a
hundreds of
methodological
thousands of people
but
collecting data.
they're methodological. Assuming we can, Greg, we can sort of solve methodological problems. The real question goes to the question of meaningful transparency. So what's the information that consumers get that they can act on? What's actionable data?
Yeah.
And the problem is, metaphors don't work, but let's take the car, right? The idiot light that says check engine doesn't tell me anything, right? So I need something more than check engine. On the other hand, I don't want the schematic for the engine. I wouldn't know what to do with that. It's someplace in between. And when Scott and I were looking at this at the commission, we actually at that point identified, I think it was something like 17 different points between my computer and the server at the other end where there could be congestion of some kind. And is it, in my computer, is it on the bus, is it my connection, is it the network, is it the other end, is it that everybody, in other words, that's another part of the problem in terms of the data. I want, when I talk about meaningful transparency, right, that's not defined. That's one of the things that we need to work on collectively so that people can make informed decisions. People make informed decisions, then markets work better, right? So that's actually really important. We don't know the answer to that because it can't be the idiot light and it can't be the schematic of the engine. It's got to be meaningful, whatever that means.
Well,
So
and that's actually an issue that applies more broadly in the
Yes.
internet space. I mean, how many of us click through the terms of service for every
Yes.
update and don't have any
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
what we're agreeing to as a result of that? And cat videos.
Cat videos.
Nothing wrong with the cat video.
I think there's a major disagreement here. He said ban cat
Ban
videos.
cat-
No.
not at all.
Okay, so we have one chance for a wrap up here. We just got the question, what is your wish list when it comes to data? I'm going to ask the big question, what's your wish list when it comes to the net neutrality debate? What's the one wish you would want to have granted to you or to the world to solve this debate? And I'll start with Pepper, then go to Sally, and then finish with our speaker.
It's very simple. I've been trying for years to get away from bumper stickers, good versus evil or whatever it might be, that we actually have, there are important issues that we have to collectively work together to solve. And we have to get away from bumper stickers. We have to avoid false choices. And let's focus on, what are the real issues? I think a good starting point are the 5 elements from Net Mundial. And let's have those conversations, because I think there's more agreement than disagreement if we do it that way instead of bumper stickers.
Okay, wish.
I certainly agree with that. And to add on to that, looking at this from the goals we're trying to achieve, and the user perspective as a key aspect of that. What is it that users expect with the experience, and how can we bring that about commercially, technically, politically, rather than, as you said, the bumper sticker debate doesn't move us forward at all.
Okay. And Scott?
Yeah, what they said,
Okay.
I think is right. Basically, it's unlikely that any one-size-fits-all solution, any panacea is going to do this. It's going to take sort of a series of well-thought-out actions, and they may not be exactly the same actions in every place, because you have to consider the path dependencies of where they are and how they got there. So,
Well,
yes, I think that's right.
I have 3 wishes. First, I wish to thank Microsoft and the Internet Society DC chapter for organizing this. Particularly thank Paul Brigner for putting this on video, because my second wish is that everybody will watch the video from this discussion before they are allowed to use the word net neutrality. And the last wish is that I'll see you all in 2 weeks at the Science Club, 6:30, for the Internet Society happy hour. Thank you.
Mike.
I'm so glad. Oh, thank you so much. Well done. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.